Hello again and welcome to another YouTube video. This month you're watching me make something I've been meaning to do for some time. That is an actual winter coat for myself for whenever it is I get to LARP again. I have made other coats for myself, including one that is actually lined with fleece blankets, which you would think would be very warm but is unfortunately not very waterproof. It has been time for too long to make a decent coat. Here you can see me mapping out my pattern. I didn't show this process in the previous video, but this is how I work out any pattern that is made from squares and rectangles like Norse coats and tea tunics and so on. There's really no need for a full paper pattern, so I work out all my measurements, do myself a very rough sketch that you can see my referencing here, and then draw the full thing out carefully on graph paper. This gives me a pattern that can then be copied directly to my fabric. Which is what you can see me doing here. Now, I must make the obligatory instruction to do as I say and not as I do, and inform you that it is really terribly bad for your back and your knees and probably other things to cut out on the floor like this. However, my cutting table is unfortunately not really suited to cutting out really big pieces like this, especially on such wide heavy fabric as this lovely high content wool mix that I'm using. So here I am, doing it on the floor like a goblin. As you saw me do in the previous video, here I am referencing my graph paper pattern and scaling it up as I go along. You can see me measuring multiple times using my quilting ruler to ensure longer lines stay nice and straight, the panels stay the same width the entire way, and all the right angles are, well, right angles. And then the same for the lining. In order to not have to measure everything out again, and this time on a slippery uncooperative fabric at that, I lay down all my wool pattern pieces, hold them down with weights or pins and cut around them. This lining fabric is an art silk in a lovely geometric design. Wasn't bought for this project, so the fact it matched my wool so well was a stroke of luck. With everything cut, it's finally time to sew. I start by sewing the outer wool shell together in its entirety and then do the same for the lining. You can see here that I'm using a 2cm seam allowance, which I actually do for most things as it gives me some wiggle room for alterations and various seam treatments like lapped seams. It also is less likely to fray on fabrics that are prone to fraying like the lining fabric is. Since the fabric's already quite bulky, I decided against lap seams in this case. That is, where one side of the seam allowance is folded over to encase the raw edges of both, as they would have been very thick, and I wanted to do a decorative top stitching which might have been difficult through all those layers of wool. The only bit of lining fabric I'm touching at this stage is the pocket bags, which have to be attached onto the coat panels before everything's sewn together so that they can be set into the seam, which you can see me doing here. Every time I finish a seam, I press it open and then stitch down both sides of it with a decorative leaf and vine design that is part of my stitch library on my sewing machine. One of the great things about Norse coat style patterns is that they're mostly straight lines. Me being me, however, I made this one difficult for myself by adding in those extra underarm angles that you can see here. I don't want to go into the technicalities too much in this video, but essentially the tricks to corners like this is to only sew to that corner and not into the seam allowance, like you can see me doing. The same goes for the square underarm gussets that are so prevalent in historical garments, especially in things like smocks, chemises and a variety of medieval outerwear. This is something I will definitely do a tutorial for in the future, but for now, watch this time lapse of me doing exactly that. And so with that, it's time for the lining. Before I can fully sew the lining together, however, I need to attach the front edge extensions and then put in the inside pocket to one side. Much like the coat from the last video, this isn't even remotely historically accurate, but then neither is the LARP this is for. I decided once again on a welt pocket, for all the same reasons as before. They stay quite flat, they don't really sag open, etc, etc. This is the longest single section of the video, largely because I've kept the time lapse a little slower so you can actually see the process better. Again, pockets are something I plan to cover in later videos in greater detail, but I thought it was worth touching upon very briefly here. First, I made a guideline on the lining fabric, which is the length of the standing welt panel without any seam allowances. You can see me drawing that out here, adding two little triangles to the ends. These will be clipped and caught into the stitching in a later step to finish the pocket opening. I then made the standing part of the welt out of this gold shot piece of the lining fabric, clipping the seam allowances, especially at the corners, so it could be turned right side out and pressed ready for the next step. Next, one piece of the pocket bag is pinned above the guideline I made earlier, and the welt panel and other piece of pocket bag are layered on the lower edge of the guide. You can see me taking my time to line these up carefully so that the welt matches up with the opening of the pocket. Both sides are then sewn 1 centimetre away from the guideline, which is then carefully snipped open. The pocket bag is then shoved through the resulting opening and everything is pressed nicely. The pocket bag is then sewn closed, catching in those little triangles clipped in earlier to seal the sides. The final step, which I neglected to record, is to hand sew the welt piece to the lining so that it stays flat and upright, and then you have a welt pocket. It's finally time to attach both layers of the coat together, and with this one I'm using the bagging out method. That is, you line up both layers right sides together, sew around them except for a small gap at the bottom, and then turn the entire thing right sides out. I did this in stages, doing both front edges, then the neck, then the hem, pinning each piece carefully and then easing the curved parts into place. I left a gap on the hem that was later closed by hand. After pressing the entire edge, I realised the bulk of the wool was making the lining want to sort of roll outwards, so I sat and began the tedious process of basting the entire edge in order to hold it flat while I did the next section, sewing on the trim. This lovely braid trim performs two duties. It is firstly decorative and then secondly it is functional, as the stitching to hold it on is also the top stitching that holds the two layers of the coat nice and flat around the edge. I pretty much eyeballed the placement of it, using the edges of my sewing machine foot as a vague guide to help me keep it approximately even away from the edge. No one is going to go around the perimeter of my coat and measure where my positioning is off by a fraction of a millimetre after all. The same braid was also put on the cuffs of the sleeves, again performing a dual function. However, this time, the stitching holding the braid on actually is also the stitching that closes the two layers of the cuffs, as the seam allowance was folded in and basted without any other sewing. I could have hand sewed the lining down with a slip stitch, but by this point I was, quite frankly, too lazy. And out of 6 meters of braiding, this is all I have left. Calculated that pretty well, I think. And finally, here she is, on my new mannequin, which I will be doing a review about later. I've accessorised my coat with this lovely silk scarf from Barocco Tribal, silk pants from Gutsy Gingers, a headscarf that I made myself from 2 shorter scarves, and of course, the jackal mask that is part of the regalia of my LARP banner. I think she works pretty well, and I'm excited to wear this outfit in the field, whenever that may be a thing that is allowed again. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you did, why not drop me a comment down below and let me know what you thought. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.